The ICF Training and Technical Assistance Team is honored to welcome you to this California Housing and Community Development Community Workshop offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. I am Chris Pitcher from ICF, and I'll be hosting today's session. Today's training session is part of our community workshop series, where we're going to be talking about homelessness prevention, the component, and what we're doing with policy review. Many of you have submitted policies and might have received feedback from us or are thinking about it. So we do have some very pointed guidance today to help you through that process. It's my pleasure to hand the presentation to our first presenter, and that is Gordon Levine. Gordon, go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Gordon Levine. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm a lead homeless services specialist with ICF. I'd like to take a moment to invite my co-presenter to introduce himself as well.
Thank you, Gordon. I'm Michael Thomas. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm also a lead homeless. I'm also a, I'm sorry, I forgot my title. I'm also a TA provider with ICF.
Very good. I think about once a month, one of us forgets the title. We're both lead homeless services specialists with ICF. We're happy to be here with you today to talk homelessness prevention. As Chris said, please do take a moment to drop your name, pronouns, and especially your community in the chat today, as we would really like to know who is on the call joining us for this presentation. I'm going to go ahead and take us into that now. Ooh, that's not good. There we go. Sorry about that. The training agenda, we have a tight hour today. First half, we're going to talk about what is ESG homelessness prevention and what can it do. In the second half, we're going to talk about what the requirements are for policies and procedures and how to self-review. You will notice that there is no lightning round included here. Historically, Mike and I have included a lightning round in almost all of our presentations, but given the subject matter, given the way that we're trying to explain the subject matter, and given the way that we are engaging it, we are excluding it in favor of a longer Q&A period at the end. So today's focus is on sub-subrecipient projects. Obviously, ESG regulations have impacts all the way down from HUD to HCD to your subrecipient, but this is really about project-level homelessness prevention implementation. It's most applicable to organizations that receive ESG from a subrecipient. We've got lots of names for them: service providers, sub-subrecipients, sub-grantees, and so on, but it's the folks who are doing the actual work of providing homelessness prevention services. A review of key vocabulary. ESG does, of course, stand for the Emergency Solutions Grant Program. ESG-CV is ESG funded through the CARES Act. Rapid rehousing, which doesn't really need to be up there, is projects funded through ESG or ESG-CV to do rapid. HP is homelessness prevention projects funded through ESG or ESG-CV. Fiscal year is the year in which ESG funds are allocated by HUD. CAHCD is the California Department of Housing and Community Development, which is the largest ESG recipient in California. HUD is the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Recipient is an entity that receives ESG directly from HUD, like HCD. A subrecipient is a local government entity or nonprofit that receives ESG from a recipient, sometimes called grantees. And finally, TBRA and PBRA are tenant-based and project-based rental assistance. The difference is that under TBRA, the subsidy stays with the participant and the unit comes from the open market, while under PBRA, the subsidy stays with the unit and participants pick between the available units. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Gordon. So the first thing we'll do is go through some basics of homelessness prevention under ESG, because it's important to understand those basics in order to understand how to develop and implement your own policies and procedures. Next slide, please. So today's presentation is focused, of course, on homelessness prevention, which is one of the four main components under ESG. I also want to point out that we're talking specifically about homelessness prevention as it is implemented by California HCD, which means that this is focused on the homelessness prevention manual that HCD published. So this presentation is based on how to implement under that. Also, just want to note here on the graphic that HMIS and admin are not actual components of ESG, but they typically support participant serving components. That's usually the case with HMIS and pretty much exclusively the case with admin funding. Next slide, please. So what do we see with homelessness prevention in the ESG program interim rule? ESG funds can be used to provide housing relocation and stabilization services and short and or medium-term rental assistance as necessary to prevent a household from moving into an emergency shelter or another place not meant for human habitation. So we're going to repeat what I'm about to say here a couple of times during this presentation, but want to make this point really clear. Prevention is going to be for households that need to maintain their permanent housing, not for households that are already experiencing literal homelessness. That is a different population. And of course, the main difference between prevention and rapid rehousing projects. This assistance can be provided to households that meet the criteria under the at risk of homelessness definition, which is one thing, or under the full homeless definition, households that meet the at risk or at imminent risk part of that definition, or the fleeing domestic violence part of that definition, provided that they are also, or that they are fleeing domestic violence, and that they have an annual income below 30% of the area median income. The costs of homelessness prevention are only eligible to the extent that the assistance is necessary to help the household regain stability in their current permanent housing or move into other permanent housing and achieve stability there. So there's that point again, the household would already be in permanent housing and not experiencing literal homelessness to qualify for prevention. Next slide, please. So now we'll talk about the ESG-CV notice, because it did make some changes to how prevention is implemented compared to annual funds. So it provides alternative requirements and flexibilities for ESG funds that were authorized under the CARES Act. So that's your ESG-CV funding stream. And for annual ESG from FY 2020 and earlier. However, there shouldn't be any more of that in the field at this point, because those are 2-year allocations, and that would have ended at the end of September. So really, we're talking about ESG-CV here. The notice does not address ESG by component, like component by component, but rather it addresses specific new or existing activities that are eligible under one or more components. So there isn't an ESG homelessness prevention section of the notice. There's no one part of the notice that's going to say this is for prevention specifically, but you have to understand kind of the whole notice in its entirety, and then there are sections that apply to prevention. Only those waivers and flexibilities explicitly listed in the HCD manual for homelessness prevention are in effect for prevention projects under California HCD. So that's just going back to, this is about prevention as it's implemented based on the manual that's been published by HCD. Next slide, please. So housing relocation and stabilization services. The ESG program interim rule, under that, you see financial assistance. So we're talking there about your rental application fees, security deposits, last month's rent, utility payments and deposits, and moving costs. And then services are eligible. So housing search and placement plus housing stability case management. And we're talking here about case management and other services as needed to help a person find or stay in housing. And then there is mediation, legal services, and credit repair. There are some specifics around those in the ESG program interim rule. And then under the ESG-CV notice, there is a set of new activities in that notice aimed at preparing, preventing, and responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Some of those are applicable to prevention. We didn't list them all out right here in this section, but that is in the ESG-CV notice. And then for waivers, that's a set of amendments to activities eligible under the ESG program interim rule that makes those activities easier to implement and or more impactful in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. So really the ESG-CV notice made things a little more flexible and added some activities to allow agencies to respond better to COVID-19. Next slide, please. Now, as we think about rental assistance under the ESG program interim rule and the ESG-CV notice, generally speaking, you can provide up to 24 months of rental assistance during any 3-year period in any combination of ongoing rental assistance and up to 6 months of rental arrears, including late fees. There is a discretion to set caps. So subrecipients of ESG funding and their subrecipients may set caps on how much rental assistance participants can receive. So that could be maximum amounts, it could be months, it could be number of times that they receive assistance. I do want to note here that we, based on the manual, would suggest a progressive engagement approach. So just something to keep in mind when you're thinking about caps. We would not want to see them be set arbitrarily. So just want to note that as a best practice. Participant rent, subrecipients and subs may require participants to share in the cost of rent. And then the models for rental assistance, there are three. So rental assistance might be tenant-based, which I think is probably the most common, and that is sort of like a voucher. It's rental assistance that moves with the participant to the unit that they are going to. There is project-based rental assistance in which the voucher or the subsidy stays with the unit. And then with ESG-CV, you can also do sponsor-based. So the subsidy stays with the subrecipient or sub that is acting as the sponsor. And that model is a little more complicated than what I just described, but we don't see it a ton, so we're not going to go into deep detail on it here. Just be aware that it does exist. Next slide, please. And so then tying all of this together, what does it look like? So homelessness prevention, as funded by California HCD, using annual ESG funds or ESG-CV, serves people at imminent risk of homelessness. So there it is again. They are in permanent housing, but they are at risk of losing that housing and becoming literally homeless. They are served with housing relocation and stabilization services and or rental assistance. It is whatever combination of those things that household needs to be stable. That can be for up to 24 months. Though it's often on the lower end of that range, particularly if you're using a progressive engagement approach. And then to prevent them, this prevents them from experiencing literal homelessness by stabilizing them in their current housing, or in some circumstances, moving them to other permanent housing where they can gain stability. Next slide, please. And back to you, Gordon.
Thank you. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the ESG Homelessness Prevention Manual, which is a policy that exists at the HCD level, governing the ways in which homelessness prevention is implemented in California. So the goals of this policy or this manual are to establish a structure for new and existing homelessness prevention projects that enables y'all to successfully build projects that are compliant, human-centered, and incorporate best practices from across the country, such as, but not limited to, progressive engagement and housing problem solving. A goal is to define the scope of ESG homelessness prevention projects, including clear information about which ESG-CVs, waivers, and flexibilities are allowable and how they affect new and existing activities. And again, since ESG-CV is the only funding in play that should be affected by that, we're really talking about that's for ESG-CV. Finally, the goal is to ensure that homelessness prevention projects are efficient and impactful, meaning that they provide tailored assistance, and you should read progressive engagement there, to each participant and serve only those who will experience literal homelessness without ESG HP assistance. I'm going to linger on that for a moment because it's really the heart of the difference between a good ESG HP project and an ESG HP project that really doesn't perform the way that it was intended to, or that anybody wants it to. The major pitfall with ESG homelessness prevention projects is that homelessness prevention projects are run by people who want to help people, right? That's why everybody is here today. No one is in this business for the money. No one is here to get rich. We're here because we want to help people. And when you run a homelessness prevention program and somebody comes through the door and says, you know, I'm facing an eviction, right? My landlord gave me a 5-day notice. What can you do to help? Your instinct, I think laudably, is to help that person. But that's bad policy. It's a good instinct, but following that instinct can lead you down a bad road. Overwhelmingly, people who are at risk of homelessness without complicating factors. So people who, for example, get a 5-day notice to pay or quit, people who are facing housing instability, overwhelmingly, they do not experience literal homelessness. People, indeed, who receive an eviction notice overwhelmingly do not experience literal homelessness. And indeed, many of the people who have an eviction judgment against them do not experience literal homelessness because they have resiliencies in their lives, right? They have support networks, they have other resources, and it's not a comfortable situation, it's not a good situation, but ultimately they do not experience literal homelessness. Which means that if you spend ESG homelessness prevention dollars on a household that meets any of those criteria, it's not a waste of money because you're helping someone, and that's good. But it's not what the money is intended to do. Because at the end of the day, you have not prevented anybody experiencing literal homelessness. What you've done is you've assisted a family remaining housed, which is good, but it's not what this money is supposed to be for. It's not an eviction prevention program. It's not a low-income housing support program. It is a homelessness prevention program that is intended to take a household that will experience literal homelessness, but for this assistance. And instead of having them experience literal homelessness, it keeps them safely and stably housed. That's the goal. And if you take nothing else away from today, though I hope you will take many things, take that away, that everything we're doing here is designed to circumscribe your ESG HP projects in such a way that they provide services that will help the right folks, which is to say people who genuinely need homelessness prevention assistance from experiencing homelessness in the most cost-effective and quickly impactful way possible. So funding streams on that, this slide, again, a little out of date, but we've got 3 funding streams, really 2 funding streams on this. Annual ESG from FY 2020 and forward, annual ESG from before FY 2020, which should be all spent at this point, and ESG-CV. All of them are, really both of them are covered by the ESG Homelessness Prevention Manual. So the source material for the manual, it really synthesizes rules, requirements, and eligible activities from 3 sources. One of them is the ESG program interim rule, or just the interim rule. That establishes the foundation for annual ESG and by extension also ESG-CV. It's the primary source for the majority of the manual's material. It is the primary federal body of information related to how to do ESG homelessness prevention. Another one is the ESG-CV notice, CPD 2108. There are additional notices that tweak that a little bit since the initial edition of the slide. But broadly, this is the most recent and comprehensive document that establishes waivers and additional activities to prevent, prepare for, and respond to COVID-19, which at this point, again, is just ESG-CV. Finally, local needs and preferences. This is a determination around which waivers and activities are appropriate to implement, and ensurances that ESG HP is spent impactfully. And so we've talked about this a little bit. Really what we're talking about is a progressive engagement approach that tries to establish, well, it's triage and progressive engagement. It's triaging to establish who is actually going to experience literal homelessness, but for this assistance, on the one hand. On the other hand, a progressive engagement approach that says, you know, instead of throwing 12 months of a subsidy under you, we're going to try a case management approach first and try and elicit, do you have support networks? Have you thought about support networks? Why weren't you here last week? What does your financial situation look like? Is there a way that you can remain housed via case management? And really, that's sort of prevention and diversion rolled up into one. What we're talking about there is housing problem solving. So applicability of federal requirements, obviously the ESG program interim rule is a big one, as is the ESG-CV notice that we just mentioned. Uniform guidance in 2 CFR per 200 is financial guidance around all federal awards, which does apply to ESG-CV, and certain other requirements by reference, which includes the Violence Against Women Act, which was most recently updated in October 2022, and had a lot of good impacts. One of them is that people fleeing human trafficking are now formally included under the domestic violence heading, as well as things like the Equal Access Rule, which prohibits family separation and discrimination on the basis of sex and gender. back over to you, Mike.
Hey, thank you. So let's talk about written policies and procedures. The Homelessness Prevention Manual requires that prevention projects have written policies and procedures that contain at a minimum the listed elements that you see here on the slide. They must be approved in writing by California HCD before HCD will issue reimbursement for any expenses incurred by these projects. So that's really important to note. And we did a recent webinar too, hopefully you were able to view, where we sort of described the difference between ESG written standards and project level policies and procedures. We are talking here about the project level policies and procedures for your prevention project. The required elements are participant triage, coordinated entry, participant eligibility, the suite of services that you offer, your staffing pattern, termination and appeals, and general operations. And we are going to go into more detail on each of those items right now. Next slide, please. And back to you, Gordon.
Answering another urgent question, and I think we were back and forth on this. This hitches me up every time. So one of them is participant triage. Your policies and procedures have to have a triage process that ensures the project serves only those who will experience literal homelessness without ESG-HP assistance. Triage process here means a method for assessing the entire group of applicants and creating an order in which the project will serve them. And the reason that's important is you do want to spend down while also ensuring that you serve the people who are most in need. Participants have to be triaged or ordered in a way that balances two factors. On the one hand, you have to serve those with the greatest need before you serve those with progressively less need. And on the other hand, you have to serve those who are most likely to achieve and remain in permanent housing before you serve those who are less likely to do so. And so you are balancing those two factors, greatest need versus greatest likelihood of success, to reach a happy medium where you are serving as many people as well as possible. Fundamentally, this triage process does also need to be aligned with the local COC's coordinated entry system. I'm going to talk about that more in just a moment. Please do note that all ESG projects are required to use coordinated entry, which requires projects to the maximum extent possible to serve those with the greatest need first. Combining that with a requirement that they also serve those who are most likely to succeed ensures ESG homelessness prevention will both serve those who genuinely need assistance and will have a comparatively high success rate. And what we're trying to balance there is the federal requirement that you serve those with the highest need with the practical imperative to serve those who will ultimately be successful, as demonstrated by your outcomes. And the goal there ultimately is to avoid the sort of opposite of that, which is cherry picking clients who are easy to serve and who will not experience homelessness without this assistance. Back over to you, Mike.
Thank you. So we just heard a little about coordinated entry. So let's talk about coordinated entry integration and how that works with your policies and procedures. So the policies and procedures must detail how your participant intake process complies with the coordinated entry process for the continuum of care or multiple COCs possibly in which you operate your project. So it depends on your geography, whether you're in one or more than one COCs. But coordinated entry is a process of participant identification, assessment, triage, and referral. All ESG projects, and just as a side note, also all COC projects, EHVs, and to some extent, some VA projects are required to use coordinated entry as their source of referrals. So in practice, that usually means that you're using coordinated entry as the source of transitional and permanent housing referrals. HUD mandates that each COC develop its own coordinated entry process. And much of what that process looks like is defined by HUD, in terms of what the requirements are. But just as much of the process is going to be defined by local needs and preferences. So HUD puts a lot of information out about the framework and required elements, but the local area has a lot of flexibility to design their system to fit within that. Despite all of this, many coordinated entry systems either do not do not have homelessness prevention built in, or they simply require prevention projects to develop their own system, and that's just how it's written into their process, that prevention will do its own thing for participant intake. So that's something to be aware of. Prevention is not meaningfully built into a lot of coordinated entry processes. Homelessness prevention projects should contact their local continuum of care to determine what coordinated entry requirements, if any, the project needs to meet. It's likely that the COC will have few or no requirements for prevention because of what we just mentioned. And that would mean that your project needs to develop an intake process that is mostly or wholly self-contained for your project. So, as we talked about assessing participant eligibility, that's something very important to developing this intake process if you need to do it for your project specifically. Next slide, please.
Okay, participant eligibility. Policies and procedures have to detail how they establish and document participant eligibility. Household income, regardless of what category you are qualifying somebody under, must be below 30% of the 30% of the area median income. Participants must be within 14 days of losing their housing, which is referred to as imminent risk of homelessness if you are qualifying them under the Category 2 definition, it's the imminent risk definition. All participants, I think, regardless of the criteria, regardless of the category you're qualifying them under, must lack sufficient resources and support networks to prevent them from experiencing literal homelessness. And if you were using the at-risk definition, which is different than the imminently at-risk definition, projects have to meet at least one of the additional risk criteria. And that's a pretty long list. We're not going to get into it, but it's a long list. Finally, projects should also take into consideration additional factors in its locality that could make it more difficult for somebody to remain or reestablish permanent housing. Examples might include, but are not limited to, having very, very low income, a person who is on a sex offender registry, a person who has a felony criminal record, and so on. These criteria are drawn in part from the ESG program interim rule and in part from best practices. Primarily, this is drawn from the interim rule. ESG-HP has the greatest impact on individual households and on homelessness in the community when used to assist a narrow band of participants. As we said, those who will definitively lose their housing without homelessness prevention, but who will very likely retain housing with homelessness prevention assistance. And we did have a really good question in the chat about, like, okay, so how do you do that? And we will attempt to address that at least to some extent during the Q&A at the end of this presentation. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you. So, suite of services. Your policies and procedures must define your suite of services in the following specific ways. They should define the full suite of services that can be provided by the project. And I want to stress that part, that can be provided by the project. And the suite of services can only include those that are eligible activities listed in the Homelessness Prevention Manual. One of the more common things I think we see when we review policies and procedures is there is a tendency to just plug in every single service that is eligible into your policies and procedures. But what we're asking is that you review your project's budget, what you've been funded for, and the things that you actually can provide out of that suite of services, because you might not be providing all of those things. So that's what we're asking here, the suite of services that you can actually provide. And then you must define the project's process for designing an individualized service plan for each participant that takes into consideration both their housing barriers and their self-sufficiencies. So we're kind of talking about housing problem-solving conversations here. The project's process for periodically reassessing each participant's service plan and amending it to reflect changes to their barriers and self-sufficiencies, because we know that those things are always changing. So you have to assess them periodically. Projects are required to define their own scope of services, and that requires you to take stock of what you can and can't provide. and then develop a plan for assessing and reassessing which of those services you can provide and which ones you would provide to a given participant. And you should also be describing here how you make that assessment and how often you make that assessment. So that's something we will be looking for in a review of policies and procedures, not just that you assess for needs and barriers, but how do you do it and how often do you reassess? Next slide, please.
Okay, staffing. Policies and procedures must define each of the following in relation to their staffing patterns. Number one, estimated caseloads for each staff position that provides direct services, which must be sufficient to meet any commitments or projections made by the project to HCD. Number two, a process for maintaining data in HMIS, including entering and updating participant data in a timely and accurate manner. And the reason we call this out is because projects often think about HMIS last, and ensuring that you have enough staffing to cover your HMIS burden will really save you a lot of heartache in the long run. Projects may define timely manner as they prefer, but they're strongly encouraged to adopt policies that require data to be entered as soon as possible, but no more than 5 business days after it is collected. And I will highlight that it is possible at a later time that an HMIS data collection policy may be put out that has more specific guidance than exists on the slide. So to the future listener among you who finds this PowerPoint, please be aware that it may be affected by other policies later. Do note that these requirements are intended to ensure that projects provide the level of services that they propose to HCD during the application and contracting process. All of y'all are required to maintain participant data in the COC's HMIS or for DV service providers, or also called victim services providers or VSPs, in an HMIS comparable database. Timely data entry matters. Making sure the data is timely is how you ensure that it's entered correctly. It's also how you ensure that it is entered without losing things, which happens basically the second you collect data. And the longer you go from the moment of collection, the more likely you are to simply lose information. It also on the other side, so not just record keeping, but in terms of reporting, timely data collection enables you all to accurately snapshot the levels of homelessness and risk of homelessness that you are experiencing. So I will just highlight that I've had many communities in many different phases of my professional career say to me, like, HMIS, like, it's that thing we have to do, like this isn't for us, right? We're doing this for somebody else. And sort of much the same way that you might like put money in a collection box. It's not for me, it's for somebody on the receiving end. And that's not what HMIS is for. It is about reporting, but it's for you to understand your own community's data, trends, patterns, experiences of homelessness and what's working. And if you don't enter data in a timely manner, then you can't do time-sensitive data analysis. And that time-sensitive data analysis is one of the most powerful things you can do with HMIS. So just a plug out there for data quality. Back over to you, Mike.
Okay, termination and appeals. Your policies and procedures must include a participant termination and appeals process. The specific requirements for that process are detailed in the ESG program interim rule. You can see the citation there on the slide. One of the more important parts of that to take under consideration is that it includes that assistance can be terminated only in the most severe cases. Additional requirements may or may not be included in your project subrecipients ESG written standards or the local continuum of care written standards. So there are 2 sets of written standards that might include further details around the termination and appeals process that would need to be carried down into your project level policies and procedures. So broadly speaking, these requirements are designed to ensure that participants understand the circumstances under which assistance could be terminated. So it's making things clear for participants, and it must be limited again to the most severe cases. It's not, or excuse me, are not notified when and why assistance will be terminated and have a clear mechanism for appeal. So basically what we're saying here is you want participants to be very clear on when assistance could be terminated. We only want that to be in the most severe cases, and there should be a clear mechanism for them to appeal the decision to terminate their assistance. Both ESG subrecipients and COCs can create additional termination and appeals requirements in their written standards, as we mentioned. So in regard to that, projects should contact both their ESG subrecipient and their local continuum of care to determine what, if any, additional criteria exist for termination and appeals. Next slide, please.
All right, I think finally, general operations. This is in red because we really, really want you to pay attention to this one. I said earlier that if you take nothing away from this slideshow, take that other thing away. This is the other thing we really want you to hear. So I'm mugging here a little bit to ensure that everybody's attention is like laser focused. This is the number one reason we have kicked or found issues with policies and procedures. One of two. Your policies and procedures have to provide sufficient information about the operations of the project that a person who is not familiar with the project, but who knows a little bit of something about homeless services, could reasonably reconstruct the project from the policies and procedures. What I mean by that is that I should be able to pick up your project policies and procedures and, not talking to you at all, should be able to run your project using those policies and procedures. I should be able to see what the daily ins and outs are, the weekly and the monthly, and really the annual ins and outs are. I should know who the staff roles are, what services you offer, what your triage process is. I should be able to reconstruct your project from your policies and procedures, which at the end of the day, rolling all of the other stuff that we talked about just now, rolling it all up together. Your policies and procedures should be a record of, this is what we do. And this is where policies and procedures most often fall down, because they become a record of like what we think we ought to do, or like a general record of what we do, but not actually a sort of day-to-day, like we do this. And the trouble with that is if the policies and procedures don't actually capture what's going on in the project, you're simply not going to be able to maintain if, for example, one of the goals here, in the event of staff turnover, if you lose one of your key staff unexpectedly, you will lose institutional knowledge. And as we are discovering, watching things happen in the world today, the rapid loss of institutional knowledge can deeply destabilize a project of any size. That's one of the goals of that. Another is that external stakeholders, including monitors, need to be able to understand in broad terms how the project operates without relying on staff reports. This is really to make your life easier. During the monitoring process, there's nothing a monitor dislikes more than having to go back 15 times to staff and be like, hey, how's this work? If a monitor can just see it on paper, number one, they're going to believe it a whole lot more because they haven't had to bug you about it. But number two, it's going to cut down on their monitoring time, which will ultimately have better results for you. Finally, the policies and procedures should serve both as a structure, but also as a reference point for the project to ensure that the implementation matches the intention. This is really to prevent operational drift, right? We put down on paper, we're going to do this, and then a year later, we're doing something else entirely. The policies and procedures are intended to be a reference so that if you start to drift, go back to the original intention, or you update the policies and procedures to reflect where you have gone to. Over to you, Mike.
All right, so let's wrap this section up with a few details. Eligible activities. I'm not going to read all of these off to you, but what you see here on your screen is a full list of eligible activities that homelessness prevention projects can provide under the manual. And then the complete descriptors for those, including the ESG-CV notice amendments as applicable, can be found in the manual. So please refer back to the Homelessness Prevention Manual for full descriptions of all of these. The thing I would say to take note of here is probably if you look at the origin column on each of these, you'll see that there are activities that are eligible by the ESG program interim rule. You'll see activities that are eligible by that rule, but have been amended by the ESG-CV notice. And you'll see the activities that are eligible only by the ESG-CV notice. And just take note of the fact that ESG-CV will eventually expire. And so anything that was amended by that notice or is only eligible by that notice, if it's included in your policies and procedures, that will likely need to be amended in the future once ESG-CV expires. So just take note of that. Next slide, please. Duplication of benefits. So a duplication of benefits exists when an applicant has received or would receive, by acting reasonably to obtain available assistance, financial assistance from multiple sources for the same expense, and the total assistance received exceeds the total need. Projects must have policies to prevent duplication of benefit. And for homelessness prevention, a duplication of benefit analysis must be done at the participant level. So that is for each participant who is entering the project. We put a link at the end of this presentation to the HUD-TA document with some specific examples on how to do that. So we're not going to go into the details here, but just be aware that you have to have policies in place to prevent duplication of benefits. HCD may release formal guidance on that. So keep your eyes out should HCD release that, because that would also need to guide how your policies and procedures are written. Next slide, please. And finally, the prevent, prepare, and respond tieback. So under the manual, when funds are used to prevent, prepare for, or respond to COVID-19, there are certain requirements related to documenting those activities' relationship to how they tie back at the activity level, but not at the individual participant level. So that's something important to note. You don't have to show this at the participant level, it's at the activity level. So the homelessness prevention in this case is your activity level. And then it also has to be documented in IDIS, but that is something for HCD to do. This applies to both annual ESG and ESG-CV, but because of the fact that it was FY20 and earlier annual ESG, we're really talking about ESG-CV here. So again, there will be a link to more information on this at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. Back to you, Gordon.
All right, very good. Incidentally, the visual pun on this slide for self-review is we couldn't find a self-review, so we went with an overview. And since it's cold where I am, we went with snow instead. So, requirements overview. Policies and procedures should exist at the project level, not at the subrecipient level. And this is the third of three things that I want you to take away from this presentation, because this is the other thing that we are finding in policies that get bounced. These policies and procedures should exist at the project level, at the service provider level, at the sub-subrecipient level. They should not exist at the subrecipient level, or if they do, it does not, even if they do exist at the subrecipient level, it doesn't cancel out the need for them to exist at the project level. Policies and procedures should speak to the specific activities of the project, meaning the sub-subrecipient or the service provider. Absolutely the most important thing in terms of making sure your policies and procedures actually meet the requirements we're talking about. Policies and procedures should not be cookie cutter. They should not copy paste the interim rule, but should instead talk about what the specific project does. The best rule of thumb is if your PAP is successful, any homeless services professional should be able to pick it up and understand how to run the project. Checklist of items. This is the same as what we've said before, but we're going to go through it again real quick. You have to only serve those who will experience literal homelessness without homelessness prevention assistance. You need a methodology for determining that that is the case. You need a methodology for establishing income less than 30% of the AMI. You need a methodology for establishing the participant lacks the necessary, lacks other housing or support networks or resources to remain housed. And if you are qualifying them under the at-risk definition, they have to meet at least one of the additional criteria listed in the HCD ESG homelessness prevention policy. You have to detail how you comply with coordinated entry. Most COCs, as we said, have limited integration, if they have any at all. If the local coordinated entry policy doesn't mention homelessness prevention, you should probably coordinate with COC around developing language for it, even if that language is just y'all intake participants according to your own policies and procedures. In addition to which, you must detail how you document participant eligibility, which is really about documenting everything on that first bubble to the left side of the slide. And really this can be as simple as like documentation is recorded in participant files or it's uploaded into HMIS. Really, the policies and procedures need to point to where individual participant eligibility documents live. It has to define the full suite of services it offers, including how often it will assess each participant's needs and barriers to determine which services are necessary, and its process for reassessing those things. And so what we're looking for there is, how do we assess? What are the criteria we use? When do we do it? When do we redo it? It has to detail the project staffing pattern, which again has to have adequate staff to provide the suite of services proposed, to serve the proposed number of participants, and to enter data into HMIS in a timely manner. And it must have a termination and appeals process. The required elements of the termination and appeals process are defined in the HP policy, but in general, participants can't be terminated except, as we said, under the most serious circumstances. You must provide termination reasons to the participant in writing, and the participant must have an opportunity to appeal. This checklist that we just outlined defines specific items that have to be included, but a policies and procedures with just those items doesn't meet the sufficient information necessary to run the project from the policies and procedures test. Doesn't meet the rule of thumb. Policies and procedures should be a process and operations document. What does any given period of time look like in this project? Who does what and who decides? Or to put it another way, policies and procedures really ought to capture what everybody knows, who works on the project. All of that obvious everyday stuff that makes the project actually work. That needs to be in writing. Some important resources for y'all. We will not walk you through them all, but they'll be here and you can click the links when you get the slides. And that takes us into the Q&A. Yeah, so I know we have some questions. Chris, do you want to fire them and you want us to pick them?
I'm going to go ahead and get us going. Yeah, so we did have the question that you noted before in the chat from Chaya. And this is about participant triage and that balancing act you were talking about. She just wanted to see if we could circle back to that conversation and how you make that balance.
Well, I'll take a first stab at it, but I also really want to hear what Mike has to say on the subject too. It's a tough balance. By definition, you were required to serve those with the greatest need first. That's a requirement. And so you can't abridge that. But how you define greatest need is to some extent up to you. And in addition to that, need is not so granular that it's like there's an obvious number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 person. You're making subjective calls about that. And so in that subjectivity is where you can start making calls about like, all right, this person's in the greatest need tier. And so we're going to triage the greatest need tier. Our second criteria will be likelihood of success. And so if you think about it as an Excel document, the first thing that you're going to sort by is you're going to sort by need. And the second thing you're going to sort by is likelihood of success. In terms of like, that was pretty vague. In terms of something that you can bite into, I think the suggestion that I would make is to think about batching rather than absolute priority. So absolute priority says, all right, we're going to come up with like a 10 question questionnaire. And we're going to really granularly determine like this person got 219 points and this person got 218. So 219 is always going before 218. And like quantitative tools are so deeply flawed in so many different ways that first of all, doesn't reflect reality. But second of all, it's not really a very good use of your time to do such a granular assessment of need. And third, the difference in need between a 219 and a 218 has got to be a sliver, even if it were accurate. And so think instead about having categories of like greatest need, urgent, on fire, right? Second greatest need, urgent, the house is not on fire. Third greatest need, that's what my parents always said, don't call us unless the house is on fire. Third greatest need, need is important, but not absolutely urgent. And then within those batches, you flip it and say, okay, who has the greatest likelihood of success within this batch, right? Who has, a family that is willing, that could, or that they say is likely to say yes to family reunification for. And so like, that's going to be a likely success, and it's just going to take case management. They're at the top of the list. That's 2 hours of work and no subsidy. Whereas at the bottom of that might be like, this person has a severe and persistent physical and mental illness, and they have no support networks, they have no income, and it's very difficult to see how homelessness prevention, any amount of homelessness prevention, is going to be the solution to this person's housing crisis without a ton of intervention. And those are estimates, right? And they're making assumptions about people's capacity, which will not always bear out to be true, and need to be informed by case managers who will set you right and be like, yeah, they've got a severe and persistent mental illness, but they're like, that's not going to be a housing barrier for this household. That's the way that you do it. You do it qualitatively, you do it subjectively, and you try not to get too hung up on the numbers. That's my take. Mike, anything you want to add?
Not to that aspect of it. I think it's just interesting to note that when we think about priority and like who needs the service the most at a given time, a lot of that's going to be determined by your locality and the funding too, because there's a lot more resources in the field right now than there were a few years ago. So that can make that situation look different. Like if you have the funding to serve everyone who shows up and everyone who needs it is getting immediate assistance, then there is no prioritization, right? And then that's been the case in some of the areas that I work with because of the abundance of resources that are in the field right now from the CARES Act, but that is not always going to be the case. So I would just consider, as you're thinking about how you do this for your project, you should also just give some thought to how it's going to look in the future as the funding landscape changes a little with ESG-CV sunsetting.
Great, thank you. Next question, eligibility question, but also I think touches on housing problem solving and a few other things. If a client is given case management and housing problem solving, but does not actually need HP services, does that case management count towards HP?
Would you like that, Gordon, or would you like me to take a stab at that?
Trying to find the written version of that question because it's a good one and I make sure that I get all of it. There we go. So the question was, if somebody gets case management or housing problem solving, but doesn't enter into homelessness prevention, does the case management count as homelessness prevention? This is an eligibility question, fundamentally, right? So the question is, and this actually answers another question that we've got in the tube, who qualifies for homelessness prevention assistance? It's 3 categories of people. Anybody who meets the category 2 definition, which is imminent risk of homelessness. Anybody who meets the fleeing domestic violence definition and has income below 30% of the area median income. And anybody who meets the at-risk definition, which is different than the imminently at risk definition. The at-risk definition, which exists only for ESG homelessness prevention, is below 30% area median income and lacks support networks, and there is a variety of other risk factors enumerated in the relevant HP policy that qualifies a person for that. To answer the second question first, people who are experiencing category 1 literal homelessness are not eligible to enter an ESG homelessness prevention project. I'm going to try and make sure that I've got this correct because we have new information about this one. If you are experiencing literal homelessness, you cannot enter a homelessness prevention project from a literal homelessness situation. You can enter shelter, street outreach, rapid rehousing, but not homelessness prevention. However, if you enter a homelessness prevention project from any of the eligible categories, category 2, category 4, at risk, and you then subsequently, while you were enrolled in homelessness prevention, begin to experience literal homelessness, you are not required to exit the homelessness prevention project and then enter a different form of project. That homelessness prevention project can, at the participant's discretion, continue to serve them. The idea being that continuity of services and continuity of case management is good for participants, and dropping somebody the second they experience literal homelessness is bad for participants. So that answers the second question first. But the more acute question was like, so under what circumstances is somebody eligible to receive, or can you reimburse somebody who's received case management or housing problem solving? The answer is if they meet any of those definitions, 2, 4, or at risk, then yeah, the case management that you did, or the housing problem solving case management that you did should be eligible under ESG homelessness prevention. I'm sure that there's a weird edge case in which that's not the case, but generally speaking, that's the way that it works. Even if they do not meet the criteria that we're talking about, which is a person must need homelessness prevention to prevent them from experiencing literal homelessness. It gets a little wonky because the policy requires you to figure out whether that's true or not before serving somebody. And so there's a compliance thing, but also a cost eligibility thing. In general, what I would say as a guiding light for that is you should very much aim to serve people who will experience homelessness within 14 days, but for ESG homelessness prevention. That's your ESG HP target population. Could be people fleeing domestic violence or not. Could be people who meet the at-risk criteria or not. Imminent and but for are the two things you're looking for. Confirm that before you offer services, and you're in a good position to say, yes, this expense is eligible. If you have expenses sitting around from before this policy came out or before your internal policy was updated, where services were offered and the participant was eligible under the interim rule, but it's a little hinky in relation to the HCD policy, that's a talk to your grant admin specialist question, not something that we can provide a definitive yes or no to. Mike, anything you want to add on that one?
In the interest of time, no, I think that's a really good answer. Thanks, Gordon.
Thank
We
you.
are almost at time, but I want to keep these questions coming and hopefully folks can stay. We will definitely send the recording and the materials out afterwards. So if you have to go, we understand, but we don't get together very often. So we're going to just keep on going. Question from Andrea about eligibility, making sure that correctly understanding that households that meet the description of paragraph 2 and 3 of the at-risk homeless definition are not eligible unless they also meet paragraph 1. So I don't know if you want to pull something back up to show that, Gordon or Mike, or if you can just talk through it. That seems like a pretty heavy one. We're just referring to paragraphs 1, 2, and 3 of the homeless.
Mike, you want to take this one?
Yeah, I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I did not write the policy. I only helped edit it and all that good stuff. But my understanding of it is that, yes, it focuses on category 1 of the at-risk definition. And so that's, what we've been going through, which is the people who have an income below 30% and don't have support networks, and then meet one of those various other qualifying criteria, and does not spell out eligibility for people in category 2, which would be certain unaccompanied children and youth, and then category 3, which would be certain families with children and youth. So my understanding is that, yes, those two are not included in the manual. And I've seen that in other communities too, and it's usually for prioritization purposes and taking into consideration other resources that are out there, but that's only what I've seen in other communities. So that's my response to that one. I believe you're correct, but I want to let you respond to, Gordon, if you have anything to add.
No, you hit the nail on the head. the intent really is to say that we're trying to hone in on prioritization and serving the narrow slice of people who will succeed and who are at greatest need. And greatest need includes proximity to literal homelessness.
Thank you again. Kari asked a question about assessment tools. And folks are saying local assessment tools. There really isn't a good assessment tool that I can just say, here it is off the shelf, go ahead and enjoy for homelessness prevention. I think you just need to go out there and give it a try. I did mention there was a point in time when the ESG leadership was working with the VA, the SSVF program, Supportive Service of Veterans and Family, to see if we could use Data Element V7, which is their assessment tool. It was later, after a year of my life, we determined no, we weren't going to move forward with that. But some folks have taken that because SSVF does have a bigger footprint in some communities, and just using that, it already exists and has to be an HMIS because of SSVF. This is not an endorsement of that tool, but just something you can look at to give it a go. So I just wanted to mention all of that. Any last questions, folks? You're welcome to unmute yourself and talk to us. I know that many of you are either in a position where you've submitted policies to us and we've given you feedback, or you were getting ready to, and this might be something that you want to take a moment to talk to us about. So I'm going to leave the room open for a little bit just to see if folks have any additional questions verbally, and if not, I'll wrap us up. Thanks, Andrea, for sending a new tool from Lhasa. Appreciate that. All right, I'm not seeing any, so I'm going to go ahead and call. Oh, Gordon has a question or a statement, not a question.
Yeah, I want to chime in just very briefly on assessment tools. I echo everything that Chris said. The only thing I would add to that is don't get too hung up on the assessment tool. Because at the end of the day, assessment tool, even the best assessment tool, is going to be pretty deeply flawed. And if you spend too much time focusing on the assessment tool, you're not going to be spending enough time thinking about case conferencing and qualitative data and really listening to participants. And so I would encourage you, instead of trying to find like the best possible assessment tool, think about how it can be done as lightly as possible in a way that leans into qualitative data rather than trying to put numbers on things.
Okay, seeing no more questions, I'm going to thank you all for your time. So thank you for attending this California Housing Community Development Community Workshop offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. Look out for more information on our next community workshop session series. As you leave, there is a 3-question survey that'll pop up. Please provide your responses. We look at them every week, and we do make sessions. We do follow-up sessions just based on your guidance. So please do put your thoughts in there, good, bad, or other, and we will make those adjustments for our future sessions. Until then, really want to thank you for joining us and hope everyone is well.